Thanks, Di. All right, how's everyone? Good. I've taught a few of you, so I think it's going to be a bit easier. Anyway, my name's George, like I was saying, so I've been here for a while. Been here for too long, some might say. So I did my undergraduate and my PhD, and I'm working at the Australian Population and Migration Research Centre. So last year I actually taught in this subject when there were about 80 students as well, so I kind of know what you've done so far. It hasn't changed too much, okay? So today I'm just going to talk about student migration. So there's a lot to get through. I'll try to get through as quickly as I can. If I'm speaking too quickly, get me to slow down, because I have a tendency to just rattle on, and hopefully we have time for questions, okay? So just an outline of what we're going to talk about today. So a bit of history and background of a bit of history on student migration, a bit of background on international education in Australia, and I think what I want to talk about is how a link on how different places or different study destinations can feature in student migration. I want to talk about the link, so the nexus, the link between international education and permanent settlements. There's a lot of evidence of that happening, and we'll go through the decision-making process of Chinese and Indian students coming to Australia. So the second part of the lecture will be on some of the work I've done for my PhD. Okay, so a lot of it was to do with Chinese and Indian students and how they the decision-making process that they had before they decided to come to Adelaide, before they decided to come to Australia. So and we want to understand also in that process, did they consider going to other countries or other parts of Australia as well, and also future intentions. I think that's quite crucial as well. I think the nexus or the link between education and permanent migration is quite established, but the extent of the permanency, we assume that when you get permanent residency, you stay in a place for quite a while. I think some of the work that I've done shows that isn't always the case, and I think what you've probably done so far in your course is understand the increasing nature of temporary migration in Australia as well, but also globally too. And I guess I'll have to let you guys leave at some stage, so I'll finish the lecture, right? Okay, so defining international migrants, you should be quite familiar with that by now. So I've got this quote here. It's the highly skilled worker from Australia working in Singapore, the refugee from Afghanistan in Iran, the woman from Nigeria trafficked to Italy, and the agricultural worker from Mexico working illegally in the United States. So all these are examples of different types of international migrants, different skill levels, different levels of migration status as well. Some are legal or illegal, or regular or irregular too. So these are really quite conventional forms. So when we try to define the international student, I think to start with, we need to understand whether student migration or student mobility, is it something that's quite new, all right, or is it something that's quite old? I think before I continue, we talk about international students. Sometimes you hear the term overseas students. Sometimes you hear the term foreign students. They all refer to the same thing. It all depends on the context. In America, they often use the term foreign students. Over here, we usually refer to them as international students. In the 90s, they were referred to as overseas students, right? But they all refer to the same thing. So historically, I think scholars often communicated in Latin, and they would often study in multiple countries around the world, predominantly around Europe. And just to give you an example, there's a bit of history. So this person, Hugh Premier of Orleans in medieval times, he begged and he lectured, he vilified and he versed from Beauvais to Amiens, from Amiens to Orleans, from Orleans to Paris. So really this shows how history always had wandering scholars who were always exposing themselves to new cultures, different technologies, different concepts, different ways of thinking. And one way of doing it historically was to have to travel. We didn't have the internet, so you can't really click on a YouTube video and learn about a different culture in the comfort of your home or your desk or wherever you are. So very 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 different back then. And this one here, this quote, the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages, it's sort of concentration of foreign students in the universities of Bologna and Paris, which were known as Studia Generalia. So Studia Generalia, in other words, refers to a place that's frequented by students. Okay, so places that had a lot of students, and the expulsion of scholars from the University of Paris culminated in the beginnings of Oxford in the 12th century. So what happened was that in the 11th century, foreign students were expelled from the University of Paris. So a lot of English students had to go back home to England. And a lot of them actually settled in Oxford, and this led to the formation of a lot of colleges in Oxford. And all the colleges put together make up Oxford University. Okay, so what you can see through these examples, and also Hugh Prima in the previous slide, is how international student migration is not exactly a new phenomenon. It's happened for quite a while now. Okay, the difference is quite different. Back then, it's quite different in the last century. It's very different today as well. So we'll go through what you've seen here is a snapshot of what it used to be like. Let's talk about how it kind of looked like in recent history. So I've got this quote here. Okay, it says the great universities of the 19th century were shaped by nationalism. The great universities of today are shaped by globalization. So I want to ask you guys, what do you think that quote means? I'll answer that question. All right. You have the question?
I was just going to say, 19th century it was about building your countries,
yep.
And now it's about working in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few ways you can interpret that one, and that's one of it. So I think back then in the 19th century, universities had pretty much a very, wouldn't say basic, but very important role to play in society. You provided a place for people like you know, back then to pursue knowledge, to learn skills, to get educated, and one of the objectives really, or one of the roles they played was to produce people and form and shape future leaders of the country, like politicians and presidents and prime ministers, that kind of stuff. But today, the great universities of today are shaped by globalization. There's a lot of different ways you can discuss how they're shaped by globalization. But one element I'll probably talk about today is how a lot of universities are formed or configured. That's probably not the right way of saying it. They are motivated by economic reasons. Okay, a lot of them depend on students for funding, particularly international students, and we'll get into that a little bit. So, the 1960s saw a lot of governments and universities, particularly those in the West or Northern Hemisphere, so developed countries, favouring an increase in international students. And the reasons for that vary. Okay, we'll get into those reasons in the next slide. But I think that the point is how universities functioned back then and today is very different, and hence the majority of student migration, student movement, is very different as well. So in the 50s and 60s, the movement of students abroad is very different from today. And back then, in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the focus was on students typically leaving for a Western country or a developed country. And this was always illustrated by the flow of scientists and people who are highly skilled in technology to the United States. So where do you think these students normally originate from? So where do you think these students come from? Come on, it's quite simple. It's, you know, less developed countries, less developed economies, poorer countries as well. Okay, developing countries. So that led to this thing called brain drain. You guys heard of brain drain? Okay, so I won't get into it too much. So brain drain focuses on the flows characterized by the movements of the highly skilled, and it became a real issue back then. So the debate was you know, you get people from poorer countries or developing countries going to a more developed country because what they saw was a potential to get an education that would lead to a better life, higher wages, better living conditions in that country as well. So what happened here was that, you know, the negative implications. So you get developing countries supplying, you know, young, highly skilled, clever people that had the potential to really contribute to society. The loss of these people going to another country and end up staying there. So what happens is these countries actually face impediments towards their own development because of the loss of highly skilled people, and developed countries end up benefiting from these guys staying on. And the argument there is that these developing countries, in no way are they compensated for the loss of these people. So brain drain was a very contentious topic back then. All right, now. So foreign or international education linked to the tendency of students remaining in their host countries permanently after completing their studies. So I think what brain drain had, the movement of students under brain drain, is really anchored in this permanent migration paradigm. Okay, and what you've probably learned through the semester so far is the shift away from permanent to temporary migration. So back then, a lot of the mobility, when a student went to another country, from a poorer country to a wealthier country, that movement often resulted in permanent migration. Okay, so that was anchored in a very different era. But as you have learned so far, there is a shift away from permanent migration to temporary migration. And I think what we then have to argue, or the perspective we need to take is the abandonment, or at least acknowledging that when it comes to the mobility of people, there is increasing complexity. It's not so simple anymore. It's not so much permanent, and also it's not always just temporary. It's also very circular too. Okay, so when we talk about the contemporary international students, so we just have to acknowledge that migrants today are becoming more and more temporary. There are different levels of being temporary. Those who have skills in demand, studies have shown they have a tendency to re-migrate. So they migrate once, they might do it again and again and again. And commentators, so a lot of academics, myself included, they've argued that international students should be classified as highly skilled migrants. And the reason for that is because these guys, they might not have the degrees, they might not have the skills yet, but the thing is, it is the potential that they carry that can contribute to the country that they're studying in after they graduate. Okay, so I think that has also led to a lot of countries and universities aggressively pursuing international students as well, and that's why there's a need to understand this form of migrants. So, what is student migration? Who is a student migrant? So I think essentially, is anyone here not from Adelaide, like from the country, regional Australia? So overseas, whereabouts, Eliza? Interstate. So, you're a student migrant if you have to travel a long distance. So if you're from, regional parts of Australia, from other states, or from overseas, you are a student migrant. It just depends whether you're international or not. Students on exchange also considered international migrant, okay, international students. I think in the context of Australia, when people think of international students, it's often they place international students in this box where they are full fee paying students from overseas, and they pay a lot of money. But students on exchange are also considered to be international students as well. In Europe, it's a very different concept of international students too, and I'll get into it. So the OECD definition for international students is very clear-cut. So foreign students are persons admitted by a country other than their own, usually under special permits or visas, for the specific purpose of following a particular course of study in an accredited institution of the receiving country. Okay, so people that go overseas, cross borders, go into another country, and they get a visa, a study visa, student visa, to study for the primary purpose of education, not for work, for education. So that's the OECD definition for international student. So since the 90s, there's been a real change in the dynamics of student mobility. I think there's. I do have a preference to use the word mobility. I apologize, I often lapse between migration and mobility. The reason why I like to use mobility, or I try to use mobility as much as I can, is because migration often has connotations to permanency. So mobility has a more fluid, fluidity in that term. So in the past, countries saw international students as a way towards opening the world, and exposing people to different cultures. The primary motivations in the past for student migration was academic, political, geo-strategic, cultural, and often for development as well. We've got schemes like the Colombo Plan. We had a lot of scholars in the last century come to Australia under those plans, and they end up going back to their home countries and becoming significant people in politics. Like the president of Singapore, he was actually a graduate from Adelaide Uni, and what you've seen are ministers in a lot of Asian countries who were educated in Australia as well. So back then, universities didn't really, Australian universities, and a lot of universities in Western countries, in developed countries, they always had international students come to them, but there wasn't any real effort that they put into trying to get these students to come. These students just came and came and came, but not in great numbers compared to what we see today. And the motivations of universities and nation states and countries today for wanting international students is very different. They're increasingly driven by economic considerations. So student migration isn't always so much a result of the demand of students from other countries wanting an education overseas. Yes, it is. But on the other side of the coin, it's also a response to the forces of supply. It's not always forces of demand where students want an education. It's also a response to the forces of supply. So a lot of universities depend on international students for funding. We certainly do over here in Adelaide and in Australia with the declining contributions from the federal government to universities. So if I have a chart here, what you see is actually, you start off here, federal government contributions to universities and international education contributions or student contributions to universities, and this is back in the 90s or whatever. The line has actually gone this way. So we heavily rely on our student contributions now, not so much government funding. We still do, but that has taken that is a lot less than what it used to be. So motivation. So international student mobility is also a response to forces of supply. So that means a lot of universities run very aggressive recruitment campaigns in a lot of countries. Not sure if you guys are familiar. Every year you've got international education expos in a lot of countries, in China, in India, Malaysia, Singapore, whatever, and all the universities go there and set up stalls and booths and advertise their programs and everything. So very aggressive that way. And a lot of universities, not a lot, every university in Australia, they've got education agents based in every country, okay? And that's just to try to recruit students to come here to study. So now I'll shift your focus to what's happening in Australia, well, globally first in Australia. So this is the growth of, this chart shows you the growth of international students around the world globally. So in 1975, 0.8 million, less than 1 million students. That's not that long ago, all right? And then in 1990, 1.3 million, nearly doubled in a decade. In 2000, it was 2.1 million. But at the turn of the century, from 2000 onwards, it really took off. So 2005, 3 million, 2010, 4.2, 2012, that chart shows you 4.5, and I think, I haven't got it on the chart here, but estimates suggest that last year there were about 5 million students, international students worldwide, globally, okay? So you go back to 1990 to 5 million in 2015, that's nearly tripled. That's more than tripled, actually. So that's a lot of students going. And the growth really shows that this rise is really quite rapid. So where do they go? So this pie chart shows you the distribution of foreign students in tertiary education. So this is only higher education, not schools. Schools are, you add schools to it, it might change, but largely stays the same. United States is the leading destination, 19%, so nearly a fifth of all international students go to USA, followed by the UK, and then you've got Australia 6%, France 6%, Germany 6%, and then everyone else is a bit less. So this really shows you who the dominant countries are. But I think one thing you need to consider, when we have the UK, France and Germany, the mobility of student migration is a bit different. And this is what I'm talking about earlier on when I say in Australia, when we think of international students, you know, 9 out of 10 times we picture them to be students who come here for 3 years and they pay really expensive tuition fees for, you know, full fee paying international students. In Europe, for example, UK, Germany and France, and I think some of you might be able to relate to this, a lot of of student mobility is also dominated by exchange programs. And one of the most significant ones is this program, the Erasmus program. And so this program is named under Dutch philosopher Erasmus, something else, his name's quite long. And he's, I think it was originally, he was born in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So he was a scholar that went to many European countries, exposing himself to different kinds of knowledge and insights and concepts and different sorts of thinking. So this program has about, I think, 4,000 higher education institutions involved in this program across Europe, 4,000. And it spans across 33 countries in Europe as well. And I think about 3 million students have participated in this program so far. So this program would be pretty much the first time when students would actually leave their home and go abroad to study. So it's actually a bit of a phenomenon in Europe as well. It's a bit of a cultural phenomenon. We've got quite a few movies that have come out from this program. One of it's called the Spanish Apartment. If you've not seen it, it's quite a bit of a funny movie. It's quite a good movie. It gives you an insight on how international students under that program lived in other countries. So that movie was based on international students house sharing in Barcelona in Spain, and they were all housemates from Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and all the cultural clashes and comedic scenes that emerged from that. So what students would do under this program would be to go to another country in Europe. They don't have to pay any fees. It's free. And what they will do is take a course, and that would lead towards the completion of their degree from their home country, their home university. So when people think of international students in Europe, it's actually a bit different sometimes, because a lot of them, people will think of students under that Erasmus program, quite different from how people see international students here in Australia. So why do people go overseas to study? So there's a broad spectrum of reasons. You know, there's cultural reasons, educational reasons, economic and social reasons. One very basic one is the basic desire to go abroad to study. So I think some of you here are from overseas on exchange. So you know, it's just to experience a new culture, meet new people, and then hopefully learn different ways of thinking. All right. Another factor is the academic reputation and quality of international institutions. So often Western universities or universities in developed countries are often seen to have a pretty strong and solid reputation, and there's a perception that, you know, you go overseas to study at a Western university from a developing country, you would receive a higher level of education, higher quality as well. Choice and limitation of post-secondary education. I think with this one, it's changed a little bit, but for example, countries like China and India, after students graduate from high school, the options they have to get into university is actually quite limited, and there are various reasons for this. You know, these two countries are the biggest countries in the world in terms of population size, right? So they had this growing middle class, but they only had that many universities, and particularly universities of good quality as well. So all these universities, there's no way they can take in all these students as well. It's changing a little bit in China now because they're pumping a lot of money in that area. And so what you see is a massive population and extremely limited supply, particularly to top quality institutions in countries like China and India. India, a bit different. A lot of universities, basic degrees, plenty. But for postgraduate study, about 7 or 8. So what we then see when we look at the profile of Chinese and Indian students going abroad to study, coming to Australia, is that you get more Indian students who have a basic degree from back home. So most of them coming here are enrolled in master's courses, and they are older as well. whereas the Chinese students are often fresh from school, younger. So there's a difference in how what's happening back home can impact on the profile of those going overseas as well. Okay. Another reason: language of destination country and language of instruction. So mainly this is connected to English. So a lot of students from less developed countries or from countries that don't speak English recognize that English is the global language, and going to a country like coming to a country like Australia or going to USA or the UK gives them an opportunity to have a degree in English and also improve their own English language abilities. Other factors that can influence the decision-making process of the student: costs. Quite high. It's expensive in general, but when we compare how much it is to study in Australia versus other countries like the UK, we are much cheaper as well. So we can be a preferred destination for some who are quite cost conscious. Perceived quality of life, geographical and cultural proximity of the host country. So a few examples I can give you here. Culturally, a lot of Indian students like to go to the UK because they were a former colony. A lot of, the language of instruction when it comes to their education in school in India is already based on the British education system. So there's some sort of cultural affinity. We also see quite a lot of Indonesian students wanting to go to the Netherlands because Indonesia was a Dutch colony as well. Okay, so you get some cultural reasons too. Geography, we in Australia gets a lot of students from Southeast Asia because we're so close. Okay, then we add employment opportunities as well. So that can influence where students go, whether they have the opportunity to work part-time while studying. That was reflected as a factor in quite a few studies as well. Okay, not all countries give you or have the allowance for international students to study and work at the same time. And the last one here is destination countries' immigration policy for students. Now, this is probably what I'll focus on. So this seems to be an indication. So if this is a factor in the decision-making process for why people go overseas to study, this seems to be revolved not so much around education, but more around migration, and that is something we have to acknowledge as well. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that universities and the economy of countries rely a lot of on the tuition fees of international students too. So there's this link between migration and education. To cut that can be quite costly, and it has shown to be costly in Australia's recent history. We'll get into that in a minute. All right, so skilled migration, we've gone through that so far in your course so far, I think. So why do countries look upon students as a source of skilled migrants? Very obvious, they're young. All right, so that means they can, if after studying they end up living in Australia or USA or UK, they'll be productive for many years to come, able to contribute to society, to the economy, and not be a drain. They would have a degree or qualification that is local, so something that they can apply to the local economy quite quickly and transfer their skills quite rapidly as well. Accustomed to its social and cultural characteristics. So the assumption is after 3 years of full-time study, the student would be very used to what's happening in the country as well. So there'll be fewer issues when it comes to adjustment. So retaining international students. So this quote, Suter and Jandal, this was in 06. So back in 2006, so 10 years ago, the scenario was that unlike in Australia, so in other countries, other competing countries, all right, there seems to be a lack of any policy directly leading to permanent settlement for international students after graduation. Popular study destinations like the UK, US and Canada have policies that allow students to remain and work after graduation. So this last sentence here is key. Permanent settlement can be a relatively lengthy and complicated process. Okay, so back then Australia had a really straightforward pathway to residency, and often when I catch a taxi, I always chat to the taxi drivers. 9.5 times out of 10 they're Indian, and there would be a student or current student, and they always mention between 04 and 07, they refer to that era as the glory days, the golden age of getting residency, because it was so easy back then, right? Now places like UK, US and Canada, everyone's adjusted their policies. So over time, some countries have made it easier. Some countries have made it harder. And so policy never stays constant when it comes to migration policy. It always ebbs and flows. It always becomes easier. It always becomes more restricted as well. All right. So in Australia, the growth of students, of international students, from 1994 to 2015, shown in this chart, you can see that since the turn of the century, from 2000 onwards, it's really gone up. Before that, it was fairly stable, wasn't it? And after that, you can see it's really taken off. All right, and more particularly, if you look at that, the dark blue bars there, that's higher education. So you can see really what's one of the more dominant sectors when it comes to education are universities. They've always been quite dominant there. Although what you also see are vocational education and coming through as well. So these are international students studying courses in the VET sector at TAFE, okay? And how much is it worth? So this is international education export for Australia, 1985 to 2015. So in 1985 it was only worth $50 million. In 1995 that went up to 1.7 billion. In 2000, it went up to 3.8 billion. So again, at the turn of the century, the increase was there, quite gradual, but then it kind of really took off again after 2000. Okay, so in 2010, that peaked again, $16.4 billion, and it was the third highest export industry after coal and iron. And then what we then see is a slump. It went down and again it's recovered. And 2016 estimates are that it is worth $19.2 billion. So it's actually recovered and smashed the previous record. Now the decline here is linked. It's linked 100%. It's linked to changes in migration policy. There were a lot of issues back then. So what the federal government did back then was actually they tried to decouple. So decoupling means they tried to delink the connection between education and permanent residency. They made it harder. All right. There were other factors that contributed to that as well. Things like the GFC that happened, in 0809. The really strong Australian dollar discouraged a lot from coming here as well. But the key thing, I think, and a lot of people actually, there has been some research, is that the fact that migration policy made it harder for students to get residency discouraged a lot of people from coming, so we saw a bit of a decrease there. But then what happened was that universities panicked. Well, they didn't panic. They didn't like the change in the first place. The federal government panicked because universities started to lose a lot of, it's a significant source of income. So what they've done since then, they haven't restored or tried to connect, permanent residency and education. But what they've done is actually give students the opportunity. So right now, if you are an international student graduate, you will have the ability to live in Australia, depending on what you graduate with. So if you had a bachelor's degree, you get a 3-year visa. A 2-year visa to live and work in Australia. A master's degree, you get a 3-year visa, and if you have a PhD, you get a 4-year visa. Okay, so that became attractive again. So what we've seen is a bit of recovery, and that's one of the contributing factors, and also the weakening Australian dollar in bringing students back. And another thing that happened in 2010 as well was there was a spate of violence against Indian students in Melbourne as well, and so that damaged Australia's reputation as a study destination. Now, I haven't got much time left, so I have to whiz through this. So where do these guys come from? I haven't updated the stats, but it hasn't really changed. So you can see here, before 2000, we had a lot of Southeast Asian countries that were the top few countries. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, top 5 countries. From 2002, what we've then seen is China really taken over, and that's India as well. Okay, so these are the top 2 source countries of international students coming to Australia. And it's not just for Australia, but countries like the UK and the US also heavily rely on students from these countries as well. And that's why I decided to do my PhD looking at the migration strategies of Chinese and Indian students. I also did some research on migration of students from Singapore and Malaysia. And I think the key thing to note is that, you know, we often see international students as a homogenous group. They're not. You know, everyone migrates for different reasons. The way people migrate, the way people want to migrate in the future is also different as well. The things that push them or drive them to seek an education overseas is very different too. So for example, just really quickly, in Malaysia, they had this policy called the Bumiputra policy. So if you were Bumiputra, which is if you were Malay or native, you were favoured in so many things, right? So if you went to university, if you were non-Bumiputra, so if I'll be non-Bumiputra if I was Malaysian, right? I'll be Chinese Malaysian, I would be non-Bumiputra. If I had, for example, maybe 95 out of 100 from my high school examination to go to university, and a Bumiputra had 90, that person, most of the time, would be given a place over me. And that's why when you look at the demographic breakdown of Malaysian students, for a very long time going overseas to study, a lot of them the majority were non-Bumiputra, just because they couldn't get into university back home. Okay? So international students are not that homogeneous, very different, alright? Oops, going back. Alright, quickly here. So this table shows a few milestones of migration policy for international students. So before 2001, if you graduated from university and you wanted to migrate in Australia, what you needed to do after you finished your course was leave the country, go back home, just not be in Australia for 2 years. And 2 years later, you can apply for permanent residency. In 2001, that changed. Students no longer had to leave the country. What they could do was, before 6 months of graduation, they could apply for a permanent residency. And I reckon that actually changed the landscape of international education in Australia. That, for the first time, I think, permanent migration, permanent residency emerged on the radar of a lot of international students. All right. Before that, pain in the ass. Go back home for 2 years. Probably by then you're not even interested in doing that, in migrating anymore, right? 2 years is a long time. So that was a key change. Another thing as well is just quickly, to apply for permanent residency, it's a bit different today, but for a very long time we had this points system. I think you guys probably have learned about that. So you have to amass a threshold, and back in 1999 you had to amass 100 points based on your age, your skill, English level, your English language proficiency. So that increased to 115 in 2002, and that increased to 120 in 2005. So it's quite easy to get these points. You get 60 points based on your qualification. If you had an engineering degree, 60 points. If you were under the age of 30 points. So that's 90. And then if you and English language. So back then, if you had an Australian degree, you assumed, the assumption was that you could speak English perfectly because you got a degree, right, in Australia. So that was 20 points. So that was 110. No drama, it's easy. But when they increased the points from 100 to 110 to 115 to 120, suddenly it wasn't enough anymore. You had to make up 5 points, you had to make up 10 points, right? So what happened was that the government introduced different ways of trying to not just help students to get these points, but also to refine skilled migration as well. So there was an introduction of this MODL, so it's Migration Occupations in Demand List, the modal list. So it's pretty much a list of skilled occupations. I think you probably have read that no longer exists. It's called the SOL right now, and the CSOL right now. So the name has changed, but it's the same thing: jobs in demand or skills in demand. Okay. So if students had a degree in an occupation listed on this list, they'll be given an additional 15 points. So that's huge for students who couldn't make the 120. Okay, if they had 110 or 105, if they were able to nominate an occupation, they get 15 points. So that means they will start thinking about, all right, maybe I need to start to consider what courses I need to enroll in. That will lead to an occupation on this list. If I want to study history, forget about it, right? I want to study arts, forget about it. But so they start thinking. There's a bit of strategy happening right there. I'm not saying all of them are like that, but definitely there was a lot of undercurrent with that sort of thinking. The other one was students who graduated from regional defined or low population growth metropolitan areas. So Adelaide was one of them. If you graduated from a university from regional university or from a university that was in a low population growth city, you got an additional 5 points as well. So again, the thinking would be, oh, maybe I need to consider where I want to go to study to get another 5 points. So if permanent migration is one of the objectives, that is something students would have to be quite strategic about.
But that could change, like year by year, right?
What could change?
The list of occupations.
That's right. So I think for a very long time, quite a few things were very stable. And actually, the modulus was very stable for quite a while. You know, you get some changes, some jobs came in, some jobs came out. But looking at this chart, good question, looking at this chart, you can probably guess what jobs were on the list for quite a while. So management and commerce, accounting fell under that. So a lot of students, international students, so top 5 fields of education for students in that period, accounting. Huge. The other one was IT, so computer science, all right, huge as well. So those two fields of education had occupations that were on the model list, okay? So that influenced enrollment as well. I did a lot of interviews, I spoke to students too. You know, some say, oh, I hate accounting, but, you know, my parents want me to do it so I can get residency, all right? So a lot of these are Asian students from Hong Kong, from China, okay? So I've got this thing here. So in 2005, when the pass mark, the points test, increased from 115 to 120. So before this increase, only 9% of international students nominated a model occupation. So only 9%, right, use a model occupation to get the 15 points, right? But after the increase, that went up to 43% of applicants. So it really shows how important it is to study the right course to get residency if that is what you want. So the spatial aspect, so this is the other thing I was talking about. Another way to try to make up this shortfall is to go to a regional campus. So Bob Beru, I think, is at Monash University. He looked at, back then in 04-05, student graduates who applied for residency and got over 120 points, all right? And they used non-work items. So they're, you know, things not related to employment. And 45% of them utilized regional campus points, right? So Adelaide for quite a while was the most popular regional university because apart from Hobart, we were the only one on mainland Australia to have that status in the capital city, okay? Perth recently got that status in 2011 and there was a lot of hoo-ha around that from people over here because that's just competition. Okay, so this chart shows you the link between migration and permanent residency. Okay, so before 01, 02, so 2000, 2001, it's not on this chart. Virtually zero international students got permanent residency in the skill stream. Okay, remember the change in policy at the start of the turn of the century, right? Everything went up. So you can see this steady increase, and that peaked. So 06, 07, 07, 08, glory days, all right? Taxi drivers tell me, glory days, golden age of migration. So 25,000 to 27,000 students got permanent residency after they graduated. 45% of people here were from China and India. So 2 countries dominated permanent residency for international students. Okay, we've got so many countries coming in to study. These 2 countries were huge. So it really shows you China and India are not just they're not just crucial source countries for international education. They're also very significant source countries for skilled migrants as well. Okay? Right, so no time. I'm going to skip a few things. So brain bypass. So this is something I want to talk about. And this is something where we then have to shift our thinking. You know, if we've gone from permanent migration, a shifting paradigm, towards temporary migration, and then we talk about increasing levels of temporary migration. You're more and more and more temporary. So this concept, brain bypass. So this is some sort of a new phenomenon. I think it started in 2004, 2005. This academic at Oxford, he looked at this thing called brain bypass, a new phenomenon in the international migration of the highly skilled. So it refers to the movement of skilled migrants from the south, so less developed countries, to places like Australia and Canada, And then these guys would then move on to other countries after they get experience. So they'll come here, they live, they work, they get experience, they build up their CV, they build up their networks, and then they might go to like the USA, for example, to live and work. So what he did a study on Indian IT professionals, and this is exactly what they did. They used different countries in different phases of their migration process. So they had a strategy, okay? So for these Indian IT professionals in that study, USA was the central destination. USA was their nirvana. They all wanted to go to USA. All right, as an IT professional, you just want to go to Silicon Valley. Places like Singapore and Malaysia were strategic gateways to the global market. So these places were seen to be a really good place for you to build your career, to make networks, to improve your English, to get more experience, to build up your CV, and then move to the USA after. And in places like Australia and Canada, we were seen as security bases, backup places in terms of high uncertainty. So high uncertainty would be a financial crisis. It would be times of unstable or high unemployment. So because Australia and Canada are very similar when it comes to welfare, being on the dole, being on Centrelink, it was seen to be quite secure that way. Okay, so this is actually a strategy that Indian IT professionals had. And I tried to apply this brain bypass to student migration as well. So this is what I found. A lot of international students actually don't really want to come to Adelaide, right? If they had a choice. A lot of them want to go to the US in particular, so that is their central destination. What happened, I'll give you an example, what happened in 2001 after September 11, right? America became very restrictive in giving visas out. A lot of students had their visas rejected. And that actually, they lost about a third of their market share in international education. They've regained a lot of that back, since then, after things had settled. But that really showed how policies in other countries actually benefited Australia. We essentially had a windfall. We had a lot of students that came to Australia as well. Okay. Now we talk about also regional bonus points. To make up the shortfall when the pass might increase to 120. People go, oh, maybe I should go to Adelaide rather than go to Melbourne, just to make sure I get the 5 points for permanent residency. So maybe the central destination is actually Melbourne and Sydney, right? Bright lights, shopping, so not boring, right? So they'll go, all right, maybe I'll go to Adelaide first and make sure I secure my permanent residency, and after that I'll go to Melbourne and Sydney. So what we see here are different spatial strategies for international students. Now, not everyone's like that. International students are not homogeneous, right? Very different. So this is how some actually, this is the migration strategy of some international students, okay? So how some places like Adelaide can function as a gateway to more popular study destinations, how even Australia can be a gateway for places like the USA and the UK. So I'll run through some tables. So this is the results from the survey I did. The third highest reason why Chinese and Indian students came to Australia was attractive migration policy. After reputation, after safety considerations, and I reckon a lot of this had to do with America and their whole thing against terrorism. Probably now it would be quite high. The whole thing again about guns. I had students tell me her parents didn't want her to go to USA because of a lot of mass shootings and all that. Okay, but it's still the most popular destination in the world. So 41.3% of all the students said they came here because of attractive migration policies. Okay, Adelaide. Why did they come to Adelaide? Fourth highest reason. So nearly a third of my respondents said they came here because of bonus PR points, the bonus regional 5 points they get graduating from a low population metropolitan city, low population growth metropolitan city. In other words, a regional defined university. Okay. And then I asked them as well, all right, look, did the modalist influence on what you enrolled in? 37%. So more than a third said, yep. And I actually reckon that's actually probably higher. I reckon that's actually higher. So they said that actually was a huge influence. And I mean, if you go to other sectors like the VET, the TAFE sector, in 07, 08, you get so many people studying hairdressing, so many people trying to be cooks, right? All those occupations were on the model list, and that was a clear way, a very direct way to getting a residency. So it really shows how policy can actually impact on international students coming here. Okay. So a quote from an interview I did. This Indian student at UniSA, not his real name, I changed their names. So he said when he listed up the subjects, so before he came, he was keen on studying in his education agent in India said accounting would help him work and migrate to Australia. So that reinforced, yes, I should do accounting, right? Natalie, again, not real name, marketing stuff at UniSA. So I asked her, so what were the popular courses that Chinese students were after? She said, commerce and accounting, and essentially anything that's on the module list. I asked her, so do you think it's a big factor? She said, look, if you deny that, you're just delusional, okay? But for a very long time, the federal government refused to flat out say, this is why we're doing it, okay? The link is there. They just didn't want to be seen as selling permanent visas. I also asked my students, did they consider other countries? And you can see the most popular countries they consider US, UK, followed by Canada, right? These are the big players in international education around the world. Gavin, this migration agent I spoke to, he said when he processes PR applications for students in Adelaide, he noticed that in their passport they often had rejection stamps on applications to go to the US. And so some suggestion here that Australia is actually a secondary choice. They all want to go to America, they just couldn't get there. Benji, again, not real name. USA, and it is true, USA has a reputation. It's a hard country to get into. It's difficult to get a student visa. The process is long, and on the other hand, Australia has a reputation, and it is true, for getting a visa much faster and cheaper as well. I then asked my students, all right, did you think about other states, other cities? Again, New South Wales, Victoria, most popular destinations as well. Again, goes to show that maybe South Australia isn't always the most preferred destination for many students. So, education agent that I spoke to, he said Sydney is seen as the capital of Australia, the London of the New York for Chinese and Indian students. Indian students seem to lean towards Melbourne. And Wendy, a Chinese student, said, very common, about 90% of her friends actually would rather go to Sydney and Melbourne. People will always think of Sydney, Melbourne, Queensland before they consider Adelaide. So really, the spatial dimension when it comes to education and to get PR really comes through this way. So I asked my respondents, do you think you might move on? Onward migration, brain bypass, do you think you might move interstate? 27%, so over a quarter said that they did. Look at India. Indian students, a higher proportion said that they would probably go interstate. Third country migration, about fifth. Again, Indian students, a bit higher than that. So again, students are not homogeneous in their intentions and how they make their decisions. What I found is that Indian students probably had a higher level of flexibility. They're more mobile as well. Where do they want to go in the future? New South Wales, Victoria, most popular. Look at China and India. Again, this is where the difference comes in. Man, the Chinese don't want to go nowhere else apart from these three. Indians, on the other hand, a bit more flexible, more willing to go to more places, wherever opportunities are. Third country, future destinations, the US and the UK, again, very popular. So it reinforces the fact that maybe we are truly a gateway to other states and other countries. A few more quotes. I've got to finish this off. Hey, so this education agent was saying, I was saying, the students tell you that, maybe after I graduate from Adelaide Uni or UniSA or whatever, I'm going to go interstate. Goes, absolutely, he said, DIMIA, Department of Immigration, their own name, they don't restrict you that you have to stay here. So after you graduate, you're free to leave. So they will suffer in Adelaide until they get permanent residency and then move interstate. And Stephen, he also said he's come across Indian students with the intention of using Australia to get a PR, stay here for 5 years, live and work here, become a citizen and apply for a green card. So that kind of makes you think maybe the Australian passport is some sort of a glorified travel visa. Okay? All right. Conclusion. I think I've talked about the link. It's quite clear. And we've talked about the strategies as well. How enrolling in particular courses can feature in your migration strategies. how choosing where they study could feature in their strategies as well. So I think the thing is, it goes back again to the shift in paradigm, all right? Permanent migration, temporary migration. Getting permanent residency doesn't always necessarily mean you will be permanent. What we see is that the brain bypass strategy, we show high levels of temporary migration as well. Okay? All right, I'll let you go. Thanks for your time. Got any questions?